for this MiFID review were based on different areas. One was the link to developments in the markets and technological developments. The second one was linked to what had happened in the financial markets, to the financial crisis, and so linked to the G20 recommendations in order to tackle loopholes and less regulated areas or more opaque parts of the financial markets. The third key element also linked to that was related in particular to commodity derivatives, to introduce more transparency, improve oversight in this area. Fourth key element was and is to raise investor protection in order to support confidence. Next is to increase supervisory convergence within the single market, and the overall objective was to improve capital markets to the benefit of the economy. And this last one is linked to the current consultation, the Green Paper on the Capital Markets Union. Not only the last one, but the whole MiFID is one of the pillars of the Capital Markets Union. But then, of course, in that Green Paper, you see further developments that we would like to bring to this legal framework. Because MiFID was adopted last year, but there were other pieces of legislation that accompanied this proposal, which was in particular the market abuse regulation and directive on criminal sanctions, the EMIR OTC derivatives that was adopted before. But as seen, MiFID review has a MiFID 1 that is applied today, and it has to be seen then, and my presentation is linked to which are the additional elements that this MiFID 2 has introduced. So I will focus on scope, market structure, investor protection, transparency, also other pieces of elements related to supervisory convergence. Concerning the scope, one of the key technological developments that have happened in the market since the adoption of MiFID 1 has been the appearance of high-frequency trading and more developed algorithmic trading. Therefore, the new rules, what they do is to introduce specific requirements, and in particular, the obligation for high-frequency traders to comply with the rules become investment firms, not to be authorized, and therefore to have in place all the necessary systems and controls to be able to manage the systems they are using to trade. And not only the obligations are on high-frequency traders, but also on the venues in which these high-frequency traders act. Second area of scope relates to commodity markets. So MiFID 2 has reduced the exemptions that exist under MiFID 1. Therefore, some of the firms, commodity firms that today under MiFID 1 do not need to have a license as investment firm, will have to have one under MiFID 2 because they are providing the same type of services that investment firms. For this, there are currently under discussion some level 2 measures. I come at it at the end of my presentation, that are still under discussion in order to fix precisely where should be this delineation between what is a pure physical market activity and real financial activity. With regard to commodity markets, the new rules introduce a mechanism that exists already in the US, which is position limits, meaning that holders of commodity derivatives positions will have a limit that will vary depending on the type of commodity derivative, in order to improve transparency, to support the orderly pricing of these markets and prevent market abuse. So there will be a limit that will be fixed, taking into consideration the methodology that ESMA now is working on after the public consultation that they launched some weeks ago. And another obligation here is the reporting by those who trade commodity derivatives, so the reporting of the position. So again, this is a rule that exists already in the US and that we were introducing in MiFID II in the EU. Another key area relates to market structure. So here, through MiFID II, we have some new elements. The first one is the introduction of a new category of venue, the so-called organized trading facility, which will be a venue to trade non-equities on an organized multilateral platform to ensure a level playing field in terms of transparency and the way trades are being done with regulated markets and multilateral trading facilities. Here, of course, we have some specificities with regard to the OTF because they can exercise the operators of OTFs can exercise some discretion, but it's linked to the best execution obligations they have towards their clients. So it's limited, very limited discretion. But this will be a platform for the trading of fixed income derivatives and possibly other commodities. Then, concerning market structure, the new rules introduce a trading obligation for derivatives linked to the G20 commitments and also linked to the piece of legislation on OTC derivative, EMIR, meaning that for derivatives that are eligible for central clearing under EMIR, if they are sufficiently liquid, there will be a trading obligation under the MiFID requirements, meaning that those derivatives will have to be traded in multilateral venues, being regulated markets, MTFs, or OTFs, the new category. MiFID II introduces also a trading obligation for shares. And in this trading obligation for shares, what is said is that the shares should be traded in regulated markets, MTFs, or systematic internalizers. And it introduces also a label for a new category of MTF, which is the SME growth market. And this is an element also that you see in the Capital Markets Union. One of the goals by creating this label was to give more visibility to the trading of SME assets and to bring some more interconnection, let's say, between the different existing SME markets, because they are already there, but it's absolutely necessary to bring more, to facilitate the access for SMEs to these capital markets. Another key area is investor protection. The new rules strengthen investor protection requirements, not only in terms of organizational requirements, of requirements for management bodies or client asset protection, but also specific rules on product governance. With regard to the best conduct of business rules, there are specific new provisions on inducements. So there is it makes a distinction between independent advice and non-independent advice, for which for the independent ones there are more limitations in terms of what kind of commissions inducements can be received. For the non-independent advice, even the rules on the acceptance of inducements have been strengthened, and there is a big debate in this regard. And also the new rules cover now structured deposits and also modified in a way the directive on insurance mediation in order to introduce some rules for the insurance-based investment products. But you might be aware of the fact that on the insurance mediation directive there is still a review going on, and now precisely it's in the discussions between the Parliament and the Council in the trilogues. The new rules also introduce strengthened requirements on transparency for equities, because equity transparency was already covered by MiFID, but it introduces volume cap, a double volume cap mechanism in order kind of to limit the use of waivers and to make sure that the markets are really a place for price discovery, so that all what can be transparent should be transparent, and there is no reason not to be transparent. With regard to issues on improving quality of data, the new rules also introduce an obligation to make available the data on a reasonable commercial basis, in particular for trading venues. So this is an element also that it's under discussion now. And a key new area for MiFID II is the introduction of transparency requirements for non-equities, both pre-trade and post-trade transparency, of course with some calibration, because there are, for both pre-trade and waivers and post-trade, there is the possibility to defer publication. Again, the detailed elements are still under discussion within ESMA. Sixth area relates to non-discriminatory access. So here, in order to mirror some of the rules that exist under EMIR, obligations have been introduced for non-discriminatory access to trading venues, central counterparties, CCPs, and benchmarks used for trading and clearing, in particular for exchange traded derivatives, also in the case of MiFID. So again, this is an issue that will be further developed in the implementing measures. In addition, all what I have been mentioned will be applied not only to the current financial instruments, but to emission trading allowances. There was, from the European Parliament and the Council, the will to introduce also a trading framework for emission trading allowances, so they will be covered by the same rules. And in terms of ensuring supervisory convergence across the single market, the new rules introduce an effective harmonized administrative sanction system, and strengthen the cooperation between the authorities and give intervention powers both to ESMA and to EBA for the structured deposits in order to prohibit or restrict the market and distribution of certain instruments in well-defined circumstances. So this should not be the rule. And then the last element I would like to mention is the third country regime. Now in MiFID II, there are some specific rules concerning the equivalence of third country venues for the exercise of the trading obligation, but then also some specific rules for the creation of a EU-wide third country regime for the provision of services to professional clients and eligible counterparties, but this will be a kind of process. Why? Because the Commission will have to first assess the third countries, and once the Commission considers it equivalent, then this third country regime will be triggered. Otherwise, the national rules that apply today will continue being applied. Timetable for all this, well, the rules were published in the official journal in July last year. The application date is January 2017, 3rd January 2017. But since, even before the publication in the official journal, ESMA and the European Commission, we are all working on the development of what we call the Level 2 for delegated acts, empowerments for delegated acts and technical standards. On delegated acts, ESMA provided technical advice to the Commission in December, so we are assessing, discussing with the European Parliament and with the Council. With the member states, all these issues. And on the technical standards, ESMA just closed a consultation on Monday that some of you contributed to it, and is assessing now all your contributions and of others in order to finalize the drafts, hopefully by July, which is the date envisaged in the legislation. In addition, well, of course, as mentioned, the Commission will have to work on the equivalence decisions both for trading venues and for investment funds. Key challenges, and this will be, I'm sure, topics for my colleagues later. Challenges for the Level 2 measures at this stage. So in the area of investor protection, there is a lot of discussion on the inducements, also in particular on the investment research, and on the cost disclosure. Concerning specific definitions, for instance, the one related to systematic internalizer is being discussed because there are different thresholds and there are issues linked to the transparency for systematic internalizers. Then with regard to the SME growth market, also there are discussions concerning whether we should aim at harmonizing most of the rules or just letting a lot of flexibility to the individual SME growth markets. On transparency, this was kind of one of the key areas under consultation by ESMA until last Monday. There is the issue of the calibration of the different rules, taking into consideration the liquidity of the instruments. Transaction reporting, key issue also, the different data fields, and there will be a specific presentation later. The issue that I mentioned on access to data on a reasonable commercial basis. Here again, there are still discussions in terms of how to define this reasonable commercial basis. On the commodity derivatives, also lots of discussion concerning the delineation between what is a spot contract or a derivative in the area of energy contracts, in the area of agricultural contracts, and also in this delineation element is mentioned here. It's very important also with regard to the FX contracts. And then the issue of position limits, again, that was under consultation by ESMA, and in order to see how to report also the reporting of this position. So in a way, I've just given to you the key areas, but the details are still to be known. And we are working hard in order to, if possible, have these details published in the official journal by January 2016 in order to allow for 1 year for market participants and national competent authorities to implement, to change all the systems, because there will be a lot of changes to be introduced in the systems and business models. And we are fully aware of the fact that time is necessary, but it takes time also to discuss how to specify the rules. So be patient, still lots of consultations have taken place, and still lots of discussions are taking place. All in all, just to say that the main goal of MiFID II is really to establish a safer, sounder, and more transparent and more responsible financial system. So improve the way the capital markets work today, and this in line with this new initiative from the Commission, which is the Capital Markets Movement, which is in reality focusing on the creation of jobs and growth in Europe. So this is my general presentation on all these issues, and of course I'm happy to reply to any questions you might have, knowing that the details of what I said will be presented by the next speakers, but for you to know that the details of the issues we don't know yet then, even in the Commission. So I would not be able, even if I would be able to stay here, I would not be able to reply to any specific question in terms of saying what will be the definition here and there or the threshold, because we are still discussing on this end. That's really thank you. Do you have any question, or maybe you wait for the detailed explanations that we have later? Yes, please.
Regarding the SME market, yes. When I read the proposal on the text on MiFID II, I found it was a little bit difficult to run this type of market, both for issuers, for companies willing to list, and then for the organizer of the market, because there are some threshold when the company grows, then they have either to switch to another market, or they have to find new, they have to find alternatives, I would say. Do you think it could already be amended with the CMU project?
Well, when this label was introduced, and the definition of SME growth market says that at least half of them should be SMEs, but even the definition of SMEs is 200 million capitalization, so it's not very kind of small. It's already kind of a medium company, this at least 50%, and then the other 50 is in order to allow them to grow. So in this regard, this was taken into consideration. What is now really under discussion is whether, for For instance, listing criteria, requirements about accounting rules, or even prospectus requirements should be the same in all these SME growth markets or not. And this is something that is now being considered under the Capital Markets Union. And together with the Green Paper, we have launched a public consultation on the Prospectus Directive, precisely to look into these issues and also look into the concept of IFRS for SMEs that could be discussed. So these are questions for which really we are looking forward to receive contributions and then to develop further all the work. But the goal is really to reduce administrative burden, and to help SMEs, if necessary through other means, and to create the necessary incentives. Because, for instance, under the market abuse regulation, under the CSDR, Central Securities Depositories regulation, also there are some specific privilege, let's say, or how could you say it, more preferential treatment when some securities are traded in SME growth markets. So I agree with you that we need to create incentives in order for this to be used.
Thank you for the presentation and the timetable. Level 2 measures a year ahead. I think that would be well received by everybody. Can you shed some light on the FAQ process? Will that be run by ESMA? I guess I'm seeking confirmation. And when would it be put in place?
Yeah, good. So, first thing is to establish the level 2 rules. That's clear for us. However, we have already started discussing with member states transposition issues that they have. So this is kind of the initial thinking about work, initial work for the preparation of the future frequently asked questions. So our intention is to continue with what we have under MiFID 1, to develop it for MiFID 2, and we will have to keep this delineation between what has to be done by the Commission and by ESMA, because a lot will have to be done by ESMA, because one of the goals of the creation of these European supervisory authorities was to establish supervisory convergence, no? And for them to make sure that they provide the necessary tools for the convergent and coherent application of the rules in the EU. So there will be a lot of work to be done by them, but also by the Commission. And we are in very good relations with ESMA in order to delineate which questions go on one side or on the other. But yes, this will be a process once we will have developed the level 2 measures.
Thank you also from me for the presentation, Maria Teresa. I've just got a quick question. It kind of goes back to the first question around CMU and what kind of impact or effect we can expect the CMU project to have on not just forthcoming initiatives like the review of the PD and so forth, but existing initiatives, and we're gathered here today to talk about MiFID, of course, but there are some elements of MiFID that have a clear, or potentially have a clear impact on CMU, and I'm thinking of things like overly excessive transparency requirements, restrictions or de facto restrictions on the amount and the breadth and depth of research produced. Can we expect that the CMU imperative, the CMU goal, will influence the thinking of policymakers?
It's already influencing the development of the level 2 measures. I mean, for instance, you mentioned on the calibration of transparency requirements. Of course, the goal is more transparency, and this is what you have also under CMU, but well calibrated. This is what you have in MiFID also, with the relevant waivers and the relevant defer publication for post-trade data. So that you have already in MiFID. The question is well calibrated, to be well calibrated, and is in line with the CMU. Concerning the issue of inducement is also in line with CMU, because the goal here is to make sure that there is real confidence in capital markets, to restore investor confidence also in capital markets. So it's clear that it's there. Today, as I mentioned, there is a lot of opacity in some areas, and there is a need to bring more transparency in order for market participants, in particular for investors, to really trust capital markets.
if I may remark on this last one, increasing trust is a good thing, but also attracting investors to the financial market is the first objective. And when we look at the level of the investment or implication of the retail investor in the market, we should also look for solutions that facilitate their lives. And in that respect, inducement probably are not that welcome in terms of transparency, but that's also a way of facilitating the life of retail investors. So I think there is a trade-off to be made in this respect.
Yeah, and I mean, also investors is not only retail investors. The CMU is a global project. It's global.
We talked
But I'm
about.
sure this element will have the opportunity to say yes, sorry.
Thank you also. Because that may come a little bit later. We talked about the collection of data.
Yes.
How do you see that evolving? Because we have different things. We have a
Reporting.
directive, which, if I understand correctly, is transposed into national law, which means that we could retain to a greater or lesser degree what exists today, i.e. direct reporting to the local regulatory authority. But equally, you talk about a form of convergence across Europe, which we've seen certainly under EMIR, where we had the emergence of trade repositories. In the context then of MiFID II, sort of MiFIR, how do you see that evolving? I mean, is there an intention to centralize to a degree the collection of data, or is that not?
Well, this is one of the key things that was discussed. No, we have this element during the negotiations, even the element of reporting, but also the element of publication. Reporting to the authorities, one thing, but also the publication, the consolidated tape under MiFID. The decision was not to centralize it, but to put forward rules that will help the existence of, for instance, the consolidated tape. And according to the rules for the data, in order to have consolidated tapes, there are some rules there, but if they fail, if the market fails to deliver, then ESMA has to launch a call for tender for a centralized system. So it's kind of, if the decentralized fails, then we go to a centralized system. With regard to the reporting requirements to the authorities, what MiFID does, and there is a specific requirement there, is to say that there should be convergence with the requirements in the different pieces of legislation, like EMIR, MiFID, and others to come, CSDR. And so we have to, at least ESMA is the authority that is trying to put forward the same type of formats. But there is a lot of work to be done. And concerning the central single entry point, well, there are discussions in this regard. This is an issue also, maybe for CMU.
Thank you.
Audio Jungle.
Right, thank you very much. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, my name is Christian Krohn. I work for the Association of Financial Markets in Europe. And for my sins, I've been looking after the MiFID engagement program over the past, feels like many years, and it has been at least 4 years. I propose to spend my allotted time, which I think is around 20 minutes or so, outlining one of the key market issues arising from the MiFID review, and that is the transparency requirements that will start applying to the fixed income cash markets as of, as Maria Teresa said, as of the 3rd of January 2017. I will, in the course of doing so, highlight some of the key issues, the key questions, the key challenges raised by those transparency requirements as the Level 1 provisions are detailed and operationalized in the context of Level 2 and possibly also the context of Level 3, if we look forward to FAQs and guidelines and so forth. So, before exploring the transparency requirements that will apply to cash fixed income markets, I think it's useful to briefly examine the market structure requirements on which those provisions will in large part hinge. So come 2017, trades in cash securities will need to be executed either on a trading venue,
if they are multilateral, the trades that is, or via a systematic internalizer, an SI, or as pure OTC if they're bilateral. Multilateral trading is defined in the Level 1 legislation as trading where a system facilitates the exchange of financial instruments between multiple third parties buying and selling interests. In contrast, sharp contrast, bilateral trades between counterparties must be done via a systematic internalizer if the investment firm on an organized, frequent, systematic and substantial basis deals on own account. Bilateral trades that don't meet that definition, don't meet the SI definition, will continue to be executed as what we call pure OTC. The trading venues include the well-known from MiFID I, that is regulated markets and multilateral trading facilities, as well as the new invention, the new category that Maria Teresa mentioned, the organized trading facility. I think it's worth noting that the Commission's proposal for organized trading facility regime, which was asset class agnostic in its initial proposal, which is and defined as a venue that allows multiple third-party buying and selling interests to interact, but which, unlike regulated markets and multilateral trading facilities, allows the operators some discretion as to how they execute the orders. Well, that original proposal for OTF regime, which was originally asset class agnostic, has been limited, as of the Level 1 agreement, to non-equities. It's also worth noting that matched principal trading on an OTF is permitted if both sides of the transaction are executed simultaneously and if the client consents. Furthermore, own account trading is allowed for illiquid sovereign debt on OTFs. These limits on the way that trading can be undertaken have clear implications for which transparency requirements are applicable and raise lots of issues and questions and challenges, including on the extent to which non-equity, differentiating here between derivatives as well as compared to cash bonds, to what extent that trading in non-equities will move from currently OTC onto venue trading, principally probably OTFs. And the impact of this migration, this possible migration on execution quality. We may see less pure OTC trading and more electronic trading post 3rd January 2017. So, before exploring the pre and post-trade transparency requirements that will apply to cash bond trades executed on venues via an SI or as pure OTC, I think it's also useful to set the scene a bit further by reminding ourselves of the meaning of the key concepts of pre-trade transparency, of post-trade transparency, and transaction reporting, which we're all going to hear about more later on. Take those in chronological order as against the execution of the trade. So, the transparency requirements under MiFID II and MiFIR generally fall into two broad categories. Firstly, there are the general transparency requirements, which can be separated into pre-trade and post-trade disclosure of the details of orders that are submitted to and trades that are executed on a venue or via an SI or as pure OTC. Secondly, there's transaction reporting, which involves notifying the competent authorities, the national competent authorities, of identifying reference data and post-trade data, plus an array, a long list of other information which policymakers have deemed important that national competent authorities be informed of. Once published, the data may then be subject to further consolidation and further reporting by approved publication arrangements, approved reporting mechanisms, and consolidated tape providers. Turning now, finally, to the heart of the issue, to the pre-trade transparency requirements that will apply as of 3rd January 2017. As far as venues are concerned, regulated markets, MTFs and OTFs, these must on a continuous basis during the trading day publish bids and offers and the depth of trading interests. The pre-trade transparency requirements will be calibrated for different types of trading systems, including order book, vote-driven, voice trading systems, and national competent authorities may, based on ESMA's opinions, grant waivers from free trade transparency requirements for financial instruments for which there is no liquid market, for illiquid instruments. They may grant waivers for large orders, and they may grant waivers for indications of interest in the context of requests for quotes and voice trading systems above a specific size, above the SSTI, the size specific to the instrument, that would otherwise expose the liquidity provider, the market maker, if you will, to undue market risk. As far as bilateral trading is concerned, as far as the non-equity systematic internalizers are concerned, these are subject to specific free trade transparency requirements for trades in cash bonds that are liquid and which are admitted to trading on a regulated market. Systematic internalizers will be required to provide firm quotes when prompted to do so by a client, and if they're below a certain size, below that size specific to the instrument, the systematic internalizer will be required to make such quotes available to other clients, to all their other clients, on an objective and non-discriminatory basis. Systematic internalizers are allowed to set non-discriminatory limits on the number of transactions per quote, and SIs also retain a level of discretion as they are able to choose their clients on a commercial basis. Price improvement is furthermore permitted in relation to both retail and professional clients. And below a specified size, again this size specific to the instrument, systematic internalizers must disclose quotes made publicly. Turning next to the upcoming post-trade transparency requirements. Both venues and investment firms, so the entirety of the market, must, for instruments that are admitted to trading on a regulated market, comply with the exact same post-trade transparency requirements. Venues and firms must publish the price, the volume, and the time of the trade in as close to real time as possible to the execution of that trade. Deferrals, delays, as mentioned by Maria Teresa, from post-trade transparency requirements may be granted by national competent authorities following an ESMA opinion. They may be granted for trades that are large in scale compared to market size. They may be granted for trades above a size specific to the instrument. And they may be granted for illiquid instruments, instruments that are classified as illiquid. Temporary suspensions from post-trade transparency requirements are also allowed for if and when liquidity falls below a certain threshold. And lastly, volume masking, the ability to not only a relaxation of the requirement, if only a temporary relaxation of the requirement to also provide volume data, is also permissible for all instruments where warranted. A publication may take place through an approved publication arrangement, and consolidation of published data through multiple consolidated tape providers is also envisaged. The issues arising and being dealt with as we speak almost for level 2 in this regard include the determination of the liquidity thresholds and the determination of what constitutes a sufficiently large in scale and size specific to the instrument for the purposes of deferral from the post-trade transparency requirements. Other issues and challenges, questions include the length of the delay which can be allowed for the publication of the information when deferral is granted, and the meaning of the requirement that publication generally be as close to real time as possible, quote unquote. Looking at the challenges in a slightly more systematic way, please note the deliberate mistake here, ESMA key focus areas. These are in fact now, they were up until the 19th of December, ESMA's key focus areas. They have then been put into the technical advice, the final technical advice, and delivered to the Commission. So now it's on the Commission's table. So these are challenges at the moment, anyway, for the Commission. It has to use the technical advice delivered to it by ESMA, digest it, informed by it, develop its delegated acts. Key challenges there are the determination of the quantitative elements of the definition of systematic internalizer. That is to say, the numerical thresholds that can be used to assess the frequency, the systematic and substantial basis that underlie the definition of SIs. The frequent and systematic basis is going to be measured by the number of OTC trades in the instrument carried out by the investment firm on own account, whilst the substantial basis is going to be measured either on the basis of the size of OTC trading carried out by an investment firm in relation to the total trading of that firm in that instrument, or by the size of OTC trading carried out by an investment firm in relation to the total trading in the union in that specific instrument. ESMA will also be, or has also provided advice on trade size, at which or below which firms will have to enter into transactions with other, on the system on the size specific to the instrument, below which the investment firm will have to enter into transactions with other clients. In doing so, ESMA, of course, will have informed the Commission's upcoming delegated acts, more than likely a regulation, on whether or not a SI is exempted from the obligation to publish quotes. Turning to what the issues, the challenges that are still on ESMA's plate, we now look at the technical standards, the draft technical standards, the implementing technical standards, the regulatory technical standards that ESMA is working on. In terms of the technical standards for non-equity transparency, this slide outlines the key challenges for ESMA, the key tasks for ESMA and their potential impact. We see that ESMA needs to develop and has now consulted or finished consulting on their final proposals for regulatory technical standards on the definition of liquidity, definition of liquid market, what constitutes a liquid bond, what constitutes an illiquid bond. This will have a massive impact on the scope of the SI regime, the application of pre-trade transparency waivers for venues and post-trade referrals. We also see that ESMA is tasked with developing the technical standards on size specific to the instrument, as well as to the large and scale thresholds, which of course impact both pre-trade transparency for SIs and venues, as well as post-trade deferrals. We also see that ESMA is tasked with developing standards on the definition of request for quote and voice trading systems, which also has both pre- and post-trade transparency implications. And we see that ESMA, in the context of post-trade transparency, needs to set out the information to be published and the definition of real-time and permitted delays. I think I can just finish on looking at the key challenges, a little bit more on the key challenges arising from ESMA as set out in their December 2014 consultation paper on their draft technical standards. And we've just, amongst many stakeholders, completed our or submitted our response to that consultation paper on Monday. Looking at the consultation paper, we are concerned, to say the least, by the proposals for a very broad, very blunt definition of liquid markets. That doesn't appear to recognize the heterogeneous and very dynamic nature of liquidity within the bond markets. We're very concerned by that. We think that if illiquid markets, if what are really illiquid markets are treated as liquid, then liquidity providers will be discouraged from committing capital to the detriment of both investors, of course, as well as issuers. ESMA's own analysis in the consultation paper demonstrates, it recognizes that the proposed application of the CAFIA approach, this is the class of financial instrument approach to the classification, categorization of bonds as either being liquid or liquid, class by class, entire class by class, very large classes I might add. Its own data, ESMA's own analysis demonstrates in the CP that the majority of instruments that are classified as liquid are in fact illiquid. ESMA acknowledges the risks of the CAFIA approach and states in the consultation paper anyway its intention, its plan to address this shortcoming via completely unspecified allowances to the size specific to the instrument threshold and to the large and scale threshold. We are concerned, even if they had made those allowances, proposals for those allowances, or recalibrations of SSTI and LIS in the CP, which they haven't, but even if they had, we'd still be concerned because we think that MiFID II will set a clear precedent for defining secondary market liquidity in other related legislation, which will not necessarily encompass or include reference to those allowances. We think it's crucial, therefore, that the definition of what constitutes a liquid instrument and an illiquid instrument is fit for purpose and can stand on its own 2 feet. We therefore urge, in our consultation response, we urge ESMA to reconsider its proposal and use the IBEA approach, the instrument-by-instrument approach to the categorization, to the classification of bonds as liquid or illiquid. If we further advise that if ESMA persists with the CAFIA approach, we would then urge a more granular assessment, a more granular CAFIA approach that considers factors like bond life cycle and currency, increased issuance size, and also looks, quite pretty importantly, at more accurate underlying data. On this basis, we set out our alternative proposal, and we believe that that proposal, which we set out in our response, produces significantly less false positives, and that's instances where illiquid instruments, illiquid bonds, are classified as being liquid. We think our proposal, our alternative proposal, produces significantly less of those, less false positives. It's a similar level of false negative, that's the instances where liquid bonds are classified as illiquid, and a similar transparency level, similar general transparency level to that of the ESMA proposals. So we think that there's definitely merit in our alternative, and we urge ESMA to consider it. Even so, we say that in our response that despite these improvements, if ESMA were to take that on board, a more granular approach to a CAFIA classification, we still think that there's lots to be done in terms of the thresholds. The SSTI and LIS thresholds need to be adjusted. In our view, we're disappointed that despite their intention, despite their plan, they said they were going to make allowances for inaccuracies in their liquidity calibration. They were going to be compensated for, at least in part, in their allowances in SSTI and LIS. We're disappointed that they simply haven't materialized. But even so, we think that the current proposals, the current thresholds, SSTI and LIS, are simply too high, and risk and place a big risk on liquidity providers with attendant consequences, we think, both for investors as well as for issuers. Apart from being too high, we're also concerned that they don't properly differentiate between pre- and post-trade transparency, as well as between liquid and illiquid markets, which is absolutely necessary for a properly calibrated approach, a sophisticated approach to transparency in bond markets. We also think that linking SSTI to LIS in an overly simplistic way to say, well, ESMA's proposal is essentially SSTI is 50%, is half of large and scale. We think that that is completely inappropriate and unwarranted. There's no evidence presented that the size specific to the instrument threshold is in some way linked to the large and scale threshold. And we think that needs to be addressed.
Audio Jungle.
Okay, so we now switch, remaining in MiFID II, we're going to switch the subject to conduct of business rules. In fact, contrary to Christian, I took a broader view, try to raise elements where there is a concern for your attention, instead of focusing on one single issue. The first thing, from a conceptual point of view, that I would like to present is this. that has nothing to do with the MiFID itself. It's a bell curve. And that's something I use sometimes, or from time to time in some presentation, just to remind a perspective that has been taken by the authorities. And if this bell curve represents each and every single day of your corporate life, of your institutions, most of the days are so-so. These are very bad, these are very good. Some are very bad days, 2007, 2009. Some are very good. Let's say at the end of the 90s, if you are investing in tech firms, for example. But it also means that from a regulatory perspective, the question is, where do you set the cursor? Where do you regulate? When do you start to regulate? Do you regulate for very good days, for average days, or for the worst case? And in fact, for a long, long time, I would say regulators were generally regulating for many bad cases, many bad scenarios, covering, of course, all the average days and the good days. And there was some uncertainty for the extreme catastrophic scenario. The big problem that I see as an association is now that there is a belief at the regulatory level that regulation will solve everything. And so the cursor is there to cover even the most extreme scenarios. And that's exactly what Christian has presented in his presentation. It's ESMA and EU Commission producing rules to ensure that under all circumstances there would be a regulatory response. Is it a good response? Is it a bad response? In the end, that does not matter really. But regulation is there to cover most of the cases. What we may say as practitioners, probably working in that direction, they create other cases and other problems, just like we mentioned with the fact that liquidity will drive for bond trading, for example. So I really want you to understand that here in this MiFID II, and as well in the other regulation, really the minds of regulator has switched towards considering that regulation will solve everything and have a response for everything. So, contrary to the MiFIR part, which deals mostly with the market issues, I would say we can at first look, when you read MiFID II, we can say, okay, those are known concepts. For example, best execution still remains in the MiFID II. Complex product, or the concept of complex product and complex product remains. There are still rules around eligible counterparties. There are still rules about management of conflict of interest. But the big issue is that also those concepts are known. Here, the level of details and the level of requirements goes much, much deeper. And the amount of work shall clearly not be underestimated. Last year, ESMA publishes two consultations, so a consultation on in two parts. There were 800 pages, 800 questions, on top of the level 1 regulation. Here, we have this consultation that closes last Monday. We are talking about over 2,000 pages of consultation and advice to the Commission. So even if probably some part of those nice documents may be simply trashed to the bin because those are just explanation of rules, that simply shows the level of detail and the level of work to which you have to prepare yourself. And in terms of planning for MiFID, as we said, MiFID is 2017. In 2017, we are now in March. It's more or less 1.5 years to the job. So you have to ensure that all your committees and senior managers are clearly aware of the impact of MiFID. It's not a simple compliance exercise because we already know some of the concepts, something that we did not in the first MiFID. So that's something that we are trying to do in Luxembourg, is try to alert senior managers that MiFID II is there, and it's not a simple compliance exercise. So really, Well, if you have not already started, one of the advice today is please start today. Use your consultant, use lawyers, etc. But at least start a MIFID project today. You would be otherwise you would be completely overwhelmed by the task in front of you. So, what are the areas of concerns? In fact, there are many areas of concerns. Many things change. Notably, general organization. Well, if you are a bank, probably it's a little bit easier because you are already subject to CRD4, and then you are already facing limits to the mandates of directors and senior member of the board or senior member of the organization. So they can hold a position within your bank, but not necessarily in a different institution. So there are huge limitations. Most of them are already known under CRD. But if you are not a bank, and if it applies also not to bank, this is something new. Of course, in terms of changes, one of the key topic and hot topic for Luxembourg and in many markets, except 2 markets that have already resolved this issue, United Kingdom and Netherlands, there is the question of advisory choices. And with that, the role or the impact on retrocession, the possibility to receive or not to receive retrocession. The information to clients and from clients. So I mentioned, for example, the rules on suitability test and appropriateness remains, but the level of details and the level of information that you have to pass to your client shall be even more precise than in the past. And information that you have to give to your client shall be extremely precise, extremely detailed, and in some cases, you simply don't have it. So the question is, what do you do? Another element that is increasingly important, and I think here we have been talking about investor protection, here we talk about the investment firm protection, is documenting. You have to document everything that you do, ensure that you have a process for your best execution, how you have achieved your best execution program, which product that you are selling and why are you selling those products to which clients, etc. When you give an advice to a client, you have to ensure that this advice has been reasoned somehow, that you have a plan and you can justify which type of advice you have given to which client. Because in case of a problem, regulators will come to you and check, okay, you have your list, okay, you have made 90% of the list and then you have failed for 10%. So the client is right. So you have really to document everything. It's heavy, but really that's one of the purpose, an indirect purpose of MiFID. And for the rest, it's difficult to cover, let's say, 2,000 pages in a few minutes, but there is really a lot of fine-tuning and sometimes heavy fine-tuning. For example, in the compliance function. ESMA, 3 years ago, I think, issued a paper on the compliance function. Now it's fully taken on board into the level 2 measures from ESMA. Which in the end, that we arrive to a strange situation from a business perspective, is all those regulation, also it's there to stimulate the investment, to stimulate the economy, to ensure that issuers of companies that have been listing their shares or their bonds have investors willing to interact with them. In fact, in many cases, and mostly for say, the non-professional part, so be they retail client, private investor, wealthy investor, etc., really the rules from level 1 combined with the level 2 really force you in big organizations to standardize solution and to propose one solution to all your clients, because it will be easier for you. So standardization and streamlining will force, if we go, or if we end up with the level of details that we are seeing now, so if the Commission does not change, clearly to reinforce your clients to similar solution, standardized solution. For example, a simple reasoning is it will avoid you repapering and doing more documentation of different procedures. If you have one big procedure, one simple procedure that applies for most of your clients. And that's really an unfortunate consequence of MiFID on the ground. So, inducement rules. So this is a new approach. In fact, MiFID introduces what I like to call 2.5 scenarios. Why? Because you have 3 categories where you are dealing with inducements. Either you opt for the status of independent advisor, and that's something relatively strange, but you are not forced into one of those status. Simply, you would choose as an investment firm for one or the other option. So if you opt for being an independent advisor, the idea is that you have to put your action where you put your word. So you are independent, you receive no retrocession at all. And the issue is no retrocession at all means absolutely no retrocession. We always envisage this case under product management. But the problem is that it's not only products. If you exchange services with a counterparty, if you offer funds to your clients, if you offer structured products, structured notes, those fall under this independent advisory rule. So it's not simply saying, okay, I refuse to receive retrocession on funds, and then I'm fine, I'm done. You have to analyze every retrocession that you receive or that you pay. And it's forbidden to receive and pay everything or anything. Then there is the portfolio management. We may say discretionary portfolio management to give a clearer concept. The rules are the same. So if you manage assets for your clients, so if you are a discretionary portfolio manager, to take a concrete example, again, forbidden. Absolutely no retrocession. You have to be fully transparent and you have to refuse everything. Every retrocession that you may get. And if you receive by accident a retrocession, you have to transmit it to the client. The question is, what happens if the client in the meantime has left your institution? You are in breach of regulation. There, if you do that portfolio management, you have no option. You are by default in a situation of refusing retrocession. So it's not something that you elect, the reason why we have this half situation. And then you have the case of dependent advisory situation, where, in fact, it's business as usual. Very strangely, you opt for this dependent advisory option, and then, I would say you have nothing to do, that would be too simple, but then you have to apply transparency measures. So it means that you can still receive retrocession, so you can more or less do business as you do it today, but it means that also each and every year you have to disclose to your client or to the investor how much you have received or not in terms of retrocession. And the deeper we go, so when we look at the ESMA level 2 measures, which are not final measures, the level of detail is extremely, extremely precise. So you have to be up to the cent. And you have to be able to explain to your client what you have done with the retrocession that you have received. An element that is important is that it's really, really important that it's on an elective basis. So you choose to be dependent or independent. So you really have to think about your future in 2017 and beyond. What will be the solutions that you may offer to your client? Of course, the independent option is of course the most transparent. But is it fit for purpose for all of your clients? And if so, what would be the economic impact for you? So what we see for the moment is some firms thinking of developing independent advice services, but for a segment of the institution, targeted to some specific clients, usually large clients, private clients, that are already more or less in this type of situation. And for the rest, until, let's say, 2, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years after MiFID II implementation, they will remain under dependent advice. That's more or less how we see the situation from Luxembourg, which is basically a reasonable approach, so that you can test the different versions. And of course, you have to manage those three options, because if you select to be independent and to be dependent in the same organization, then you have to ensure that there are compliance measures that ensures that once the client comes to your institution, it's fully segregated. And you know if you have provided this or that type of service to that client at a particular moment. What is important to keep in mind, and ESMA triggered, thanks to the FCA, sorry, an interesting discussion on research that are considered as inducement or not. The concept of inducement, when you read it, if you read it with the eyes of MiFID I, basically it's, okay, you have to pay attention to your fund business and then that's it. But the problem is, there are many instances in the regulation where attention is attracted to markets. So if you deal with a broker, you may receive fees, or you may receive retrocession or rebates. Those may as well qualify under the inducement regime. And another element that is also important is that you are often in a position to see the retrocession that you receive. But if I take a case again of Luxembourg, there are many third-party advisors to which you may pay retrocession. And then the question is, what do you do with them? Do they disclose, and how do they present themselves to their client? Imagine a situation where you have one of those third-party advisors that tells his or her client, I am independent, and in fact continues to ask you retrocession. What is your responsibility? It's not solved, not clear, but nevertheless, those are practical questions that you have to ask yourself. So, as I asked the question earlier to Maite, the real problem from our point of view is not really for the wealthy clients, for the professional clients. They know what's going on, they will opt for one or the other, they will ask you for one or the other option. The problem is for retail clients, they are already, at least in Continental, you're already afraid to come to a bank for to discuss their investments. So now you will have to tell them, okay, look, now because of transparency, I will advise you. You will pay for my advice, you will buy my products, you will pay for my products, and then there will be maintenance fees that you will have to pay. So what's the message for the client? Instead of a solution where basically under the dependent advice, you say, okay, I provide you advice for free, and then I arrange for the rest on my side. So that's a question for the pure retail market. We see the consequences in the UK. If you, several surveys show that if you have a portfolio under £100,000, you seldom receive advice, or you have to go to websites or to a robo-advisor or whatever, but you do not have personal advice as you had in the past, which is a detrimental consequence, totally against the objective, from my point of view, of the MiFID II. And then this last remark comes with this one. We also see this discussion on inducement and the different business profile or business option that you may choose, because we are in the business for quite a long time. The problem is that, let's imagine that tomorrow, I don't make any publicity and I haven't heard anything specific, but let's imagine that tomorrow Facebook came to the investment world. Well, will the discussion for that type of firm on inducement be so important? Probably they will have a different business model in mind than simply receiving retrocession and sitting on something. So we have to think that this regulation may as well trigger some new entrants and some new approach to the business. Okay, information. MiFID II aims to empower the investor. And that's a message that is consistent with the message from the EU Commission from quite a while. And investors have to have the choice and be able to understand what they are doing. One of the big problems that the level of detail that is brought to the investor is so important that first, I'm not certain that they will be able to pick and choose the right solution for them. For example, you have to disclose your best execution, you have to disclose your 5 preferred execution venues per segment, per market, etc. Will my grandmother pay any attention to that? No, definitely not. Of course, if you are dealing with institutional, that is of importance, but they will already ask you today. And if they are not satisfied, they will switch shop. So what's the value of producing this information? And one of the elements that frustrates many in the industry, at least from Luxembourg a lot, is the information that you have to provide to your clients when you sell the packaged products. Of course, you have to offer and to give to the clients the briefs or the key document for usage. So this 2-page document to inform the client about the product, key features, etc. But if you look at the level of details in ESMA, they even ask you to be able to present the total cost of those products, which means that not only you have to disclose the management fee of, let's say, a fund, but you also have to be able to identify the transaction costs of that fund and present that to your client. Of course, if you receive retrocession, you have to include that in the total cost of the product. The question we have is, okay, how do you proceed from practical point of view to disclose the transaction cost of a fund that is not an in-house fund? Well, in the future probably it will come, but for the moment, I would say we have a problem. And post-trade, you have to disclose those information to the client, itemized and on an individual basis. It's upon request, so you can have, for the moment, averages, but then you have to go, or to be able to offer this information individualized. Thus, clearly, also, we may have logically expected that the key or briefs would have been enough for informing clients. Probably it will not be in the future. So we have to see what the Commission will produce, because for the moment those are based on advice from ESMA to the EU Commission, but well, we may still have some surprises. And we will not have time to prepare. That's the worst part of the equation. Briefly about products. So ESMA introduces something completely new. Now, if you are a firm that creates products, packaged products, so not a big company that issues shares, you have to define a target market to whom you will offer those products. Ensure that if you define the market, those products are channeled through to the right investor. So if you use intermediaries, let's say you are Goldman Sachs, you manufacture structured notes, and you say it's for wealthy Belgian clients. What would happen if all of a sudden one of your distributors sold those products in Spain to an average rich client? Those are issues to which you are confronted. And remember what Maria said, there is a sanction there is a huge and important sanction regime, including the MiFID. And here you have to analyze all those elements. And if you are, in this case, if you are Goldman Sachs, you have to ensure that once you use the intermediaries, those intermediaries do understand the product, and you have to ensure somehow that, or work with them to ensure that to the maximum extent they respect your distribution and your requirements. There are some funny things also. You remember this execution-only instruments. There are also some funny things there. So in the past, MiFID I, you are allowed to offer your clients an easy access via your trading platform to simple instruments, basically equities, bonds, and funds. But now, under MiFID II, there may be differences. So not all equities or not all shares will be treated necessarily the same for bonds and for funds. So you may have UCITS funds that are classified as complex and non-complex. And then if they are complex, then you are not allowed anymore to do execution only. You have to do appropriateness at least. So new tests. Perhaps it's not the end of the world, but if you have investors that are quite active, trading for their own accounts, themselves, retail, or the category of retail is extremely broad, they may have some surprises. If they do not invest, for example, in equivalent, as you said, equivalent markets to the European Union, so for shares or bonds, well, it will not be execution only anymore. So it also means that you have to gather all those data to ensure that your database offers good information and is constantly upgraded with the good information so that you offer the right service to your clients. Well, there are other changes, like best execution. It's now a little bit, it's now even more precise. You have to list specifically trading venues and access to those, the access of your preferred trading venues. Eligible counterparties, so banks dealing among banks. In the past, that was very easy. You have a procedure for retail, an average procedure for professional, which was very close to retail, and then for other banks, there are big guys, boys, they know what they are doing, they are all eligible, so I don't care. Basically, that character. The problem is that now, eligible counterparties, we have really eligible counterparties and counterparties that are eligible so-so. So you have to check even if the status of your counterparty is eligible, if it's really eligible or not. So if it's a 5% bank in the south of Germany or JP Morgan, those are two eligible counterparties in theory, but in your position, you may see that there may be some differences. And now you have to take that into account. That was also specific for some say, public entities that were qualified as eligible that are now no more eligible counterparties. Provision also changed for third country firms, so non-European firms willing to access the European market, either for retail or for institutional. Specifically the case for Swiss institutions targeting European clients. They are not very happy by that. There is this one, the accounts and asset segregation. This is one of the worst nightmares of the last few years, and a revolving subject. There is this idea at the Commission and some EU, by some authorities, that one of the best ways to protect clients against the failure, meaning bankruptcy, of financial institution, is to ensure that the segregation of its portfolio is up to the issuer in the country where the issuer is located. So you have to ensure transparency all across the chain, meaning no more omnibus accounts. And in fact, in the MiFID II, ESMA tried to introduce this type of rules, generally speaking. And fortunately, in the last document that they published in December, which will be sent to the EU Commission, this segregation rules is only for non-banks. Well, there are some additional details, but if you are not a bank and provide financial services, you have to ensure that across or up to the moment you arrive into the banking environment, all your accounts are fully and well segregated client by clients, and of course then instrument by instrument, which may also create some issues in terms of collateral management for some of those non-bank institutions. One detail, this is, although all those requirements are based on the current procedure and current approach, but many things can be done on electronic form once you have an email address of your client. So it's probably even more important than in the past to ensure that having an access to an email address of one of your clients may improve your attitude vis-à-vis trees saving, because then you can send PDF files or you can send electronic files instead of pure paper. In terms of conclusion, I think first and foremost, really now we have to think about the strategy. It's, well, you do not have much time, but you have to think now and think fast. Medium-sized institution, as I asked the question earlier, really they may face very, very important issues in terms of trading, in terms of retrocession, in terms of competition. So clearly, I think they will not be able to do everything anymore. Start today, ESMA consultation, there are over 200, there are over 2,500 pages. And mid-February they published an addendum to their consultation, so another 500 or 50 or so pages. And I'm sure that for Easter we will have a new egg from ESMA. Perhaps not for Easter, but at a later stage clearly we will have something. Third, prepare for flexible scenario, or for an agile application of flexible scenario, at least in terms of your status vis-à-vis your advice. If you opt for dependent or independent advice, you have to think what will be the solution in the future. Because, for example, on the Belgian market, if today KBL is dependent, for example, I don't know, so, but if KBL is considering to be dependent advisor, what would happen if tomorrow they think, well, in the end, being independent is better for us? What will ING, what will BNP Paribas Fortis do? Or Belfius do? Will they stay in their own strategy? Or will they be forced to switch to the strategy of their competitor? That will probably not come in 2017, but come 2017 or 2018, etc. Probably that's an issue that you will face. And then, fourth and last comment, ensure that everything is documented. From a protection perspective from your organization, I think that's one of the key elements of this new regulation.
Audio Jungle.
Thank you. So during this presentation, we are going to present the implementation challenges that MiFID II is going to bring in terms of transaction reporting. To illustrate our presentation, we have chosen this small cartoon where basically we see two guys. They look a little bit disorganized. They seem also a bit rushed. One is telling to the other, get all the information you can, we will think of a use for it later. Well, if you think, MiFID is not only about getting all the information in a quick and dirty way and putting it in a fancy reporting. Remember when banks were all pushed into achieving compliance in other regulations such as EMIR, MiFID I, and other regulations. Some of them are still paying the price of inefficient implementation because they did not take the time to sit around the table and to implement the regulation in a proper fashion. MiFID II, as we said, is due to happen in January 2017. So banks should now, without delay, look at the implementation challenges and take the opportunity to implement something strategic within the period of time still available. In terms of agenda, the presentation is comprised of three parts. In the first part, we highlight the big changes that MiFID brings in terms of compared to its old version of MiFID I. Then we're going to draw our attention to the implementation challenges that banks will have to manage before the due date. Finally, last but not least, we will try to give some conclusions and to give you the key takeaways that you should all bring back home to your financial institutions. In terms of organization, as Freddy said, we will take one or two questions, if time allows. I'm going to cover all the slides, and if Freddy wants, he can also intervene sometimes to share some of his experience. Should there be any tricky questions, then we will take them on paper. If we are not able to answer them, of course, we will take them on paper and we will revert back to you with written answers. So let's kick off the presentations. When we speak about reporting requirements under MiFID, we need to make a distinction between transparency reporting and transaction reporting. Christian already talked about transparency reporting. It's all about orders, pricing, information execution information. The second part is transaction reporting, and it was designed basically to identify market abuse. And this is on this part that the presentation will focus. So, the first big change for MiFID II is that in terms of what investment products are in scope for MiFID II and were actually in scope for MiFID I, it is basically all investment products. But for MiFID I, the detailed reporting provisions were applied only to equity and derivatives. So the big change here for MiFID II is that it expands the reporting scope to cover a much wider asset class coverage, which does not just include equities and their derivatives, but also all sorts of products such as FX, interest rate, structured finance, commodities, fixed income, and all flavors of derivatives. The next big change for MiFID II is that whereas under MiFID I, banks had only to report for transaction reporting around 25 fields, the banks now have to report 51 fields. The new sort of data that banks will have to report are, for example, a trader ID, also identifying who made the decision to do the investment, and all sorts of IDs. There will be also a necessity to report some flags, such as the commodity flag, the derivative flag, and the short selling flags. So the key message here, I guess, for this slide is that is to say that the number of fields will increase by a large extent. The next big point is the timeliness of the MiFID II reporting. For transaction reporting, investment firms which execute transactions in financial instruments shall report complete and accurate details of such transactions to the competent authority, and that as quickly as possible and no later than the close of the following working day. For transparency disclosure, investment firms which either on own account or on behalf of clients concludes transaction traded on a trading venue shall make public the volume, the price, and the time of these transactions, and that as close to real time as is technically possible. So this obviously will be a challenge for banks and might require firms to upgrade their reporting processes. So we have now looked at the main changes for MiFID II in terms of reporting. Let's now look in more detail at the challenges that the bank will have to tackle. Well, the first one is more of a general point. If not done yet, obviously, banks should put in place a project planning. As we said in the introductions, banks were all rushed into achieving compliance in other regulations, such as EMIR and MiFID I. And some of them are still paying the price of inefficiencies. Banks should try to avoid to do the same mistakes and benefit from the time still available to implement something strategic for MiFID II. Once the project plan is in place, that's not done yet. MiFID II is complex, as we said. Guidance, discussion papers, consultation papers accounts for around 2,000 pages. And as we saw for other regulations, such as EMIR and MiFID I, we can expect also for MiFID II a certain amount of uncertainties all the way up till January 2017. So the message here I want to convey is that banks should implement, project manager in banks should try to think and implement a project plan which are flexible enough to cope with the many moving parts of MiFID II. Another challenge that banks will have to answer is what product and what activities will fall under the MiFID II reporting. Once this assessment is done, they will have to think on the one hand, what are the source systems that MiFID will bring into scope. On the other hand, they will have to think what are the reporting solutions necessary to handle the MiFID II deadline. Particularly for the reporting solutions, banks need to ensure that their existing reporting solution can harmonize trades from all their multiple internal systems into a common format. Secondly, they need to ensure that these reporting solutions can cover this product in a granular way. Finally, they need to ensure that these systems can endure the increased volume of data that MiFID II will bring. as we said in the section just before, MiFID II will bring, you will need to report more data. Obviously, banks will have to look in the front and in the back office systems, and that's fine. But the data will need to be pulled together, and this will be a challenge for banks in terms of how they will set up the reporting infrastructure. One might think that implementing MiFID II reporting is not that difficult, because a great part can be leveraged on what was done for EMIR and MiFID I. Well, that might not be entirely true. Indeed, there are some data that will be similar to EMIR and MiFID I, but there are also a lot of data that are completely new. And also, banks should also pay attention to the fact that there will be some data with the same name in different regulations, but if you look in more detail in the interpretation, they can be slightly different. So what we would advise here for banks is to put in place a data gap analysis in order to identify the data missing to the MiFID II reporting. The question here is, to who does the bank report? Well, it is most likely that the bank will report to trade repositories. Trade repositories will also need to get ready for MiFID. And this will be a challenge also for them. So even if trade repositories are supporting MiFID II, banks absolutely need to comply with technical standards and plan for some testing to cope with the MiFID II reporting. One last implementation challenge, it's about the data governance. The reportings produced by the banks needs obviously to be consistent with each other. Banks will also need to ensure completeness and accuracy of its reporting. We have seen in the past supervisors giving some fines to financial institutions for failures in transaction reporting. Well, the first advice we can give is then to put in place some reconciliation routines in order to avoid such problem. And also, on top of that, what we would advise is to put a data governance framework which is efficient enough to identify within the financial institutions the roles and responsibility of everyone in terms of ownerships of the data and oversight of the reporting. The conclusion now. What is the next priority? Well, the next priority is for banks, obviously, to put this project plan in place, if it is not done yet. In this plan, they need to assess really if the reporting solutions have the characteristics and the capabilities to handle both EMIR and MiFID II reporting requirements. If they don't, then banks need to put in place a remediation plan to start fill the gaps. Thank you for your attention.
Audio Jungle.